Hi, I'm Ian Blatchford, Director of the Science Museum, and it's wonderful to see so many great colleagues I know very well and some new faces as well. And just to say also to you, Charlotte, how delighted I am that we're hosting this with you. We've not always been completely devoted to the history of science in a true academic and rigorous sense, but actually we certainly are now. And it's also, if I may say so, particularly lovely to see you back, Ludmilla, who served with such distinction on the board. And believe me, if you want a warrior for the history of science, Ludmilla is your woman. My goodness me, she was terrific for us. So the exam question, so to speak, officially, rather than on the slide, says, what perspectives can historians of science uniquely bring to academic and public discussion? And I wanted to start with just I have a prop with me to explain why I think it is not an important question. It's an unbelievably important question, because I've just been to an event which is the kind of surreal thing that museum directors get invited to. I've just come back from Delhi. I was there during, record-breaking temperatures at something called the Rasina Dialogue, which is India's equivalent of Davos. And you can imagine that the world's largest democracy is considering lots of big issues. What to do about the future of energy, what to do about the role and profile of women, and what to do about all the health challenges it faces. And in this vast gathering, it was full of the kind of people that most of us don't meet normally. So the room was full of admirals and generals, policy think tank people, NGOs, economists, and amongst this huge gathering, there was me as the only person who didn't fit into that group. And the reason I was there is because Alex Ellis, who is the British High Commissioner in Delhi, is a great fan of museums, and thought actually it's really very, very strange that in this great gathering to talk about the future of India, there is not one single historian. And the reason I think that matters is because a phrase I use quite a lot is, I think there's a curse which I call the nowness of now. And what I mean by that is that when all these great minds were debating the future of India, they were talking about the problems of India as if society had never faced challenges before. That actually, there'd never been energy challenges before, that disease had never really existed before, that no society had ever, changed its view of women in politics and business. And I have to say, it was kind of amusing, but also kind of disturbing, actually, because it seemed to me that actually the contribution that we can make, not only to the public, but also to the great issues of the day, is pretty awesome if we put our mind to it. No pressure, panel, by the way. But just the future of humanity is in your hands. So the format will be that we once again have speakers. A little thing just to say to the panel, either with the microphone in front or the microphone in front of you, please do use it, not just so that people can hear you, but we can record everything so we know what you said. One little joke I'll say to the panel when we do get to questions is, I always remind people of a wonderful press conference we had here years ago when we were launching the Cosmonaut exhibition, and Alexei Leonev, first man to walk in space, was being asked questions. One person asked a very, 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 very long question, at the end of which Alexei Leonev said, "That is not a question, I'm ignoring you." And that was it. So it's up to you, panel, whether you want to ignore the questions, but I'm here to referee. So I have to say, I don't know about the panel, but maybe because of the mic in front, it looks slightly like a stand-up comedy club. And I kind of feel that one of the Science Museum's great chums, Dara O'Brien, will appear at any moment with a buzzer. But unfortunately, I don't have a buzzer. I just have my menacing gaze if someone speaks for too long. So we have a running order, and so I'm going to sit down and turn to you, Charlotte, as our first speaker. Thank you.
One of my least favourite conversations is the conversation that I have quite often in taxi cabs. And it's the conversation that begins, "What do you do for a living?" And I say, "I'm a lecturer." And they say, "What in?" And I'm like, okay, how long is this journey going to be? Because that answer is a paragraph, not a word. So sometimes I go in with, "I'm a historian," and then I get the comeback of what period, and then I sort of hum and ha a bit, and I say, well, It's kind of more a theme than a period. It's this thing that's called the history of science. I once got asked in America, the follow-up was, what's your favourite era in history? I was really puzzled by that, but it turned out they meant era. It still didn't really help, but never mind. And it's a problem that many people in this room face in an even more extreme sort of way, because actually your day job title may be that you're a lecturer in a sociology department, or in a philosophy department, or you're in a science department. So what are you? There is, I think, a real invisibility of the profession in that key institutional niche, which is the university, not just in this country, but I think around the world. And one of the really interesting questions about that departmental title is many of us, myself included, are in a department called Science and Technology Studies. And that's a place where I'm very, very happy to be. But it does highlight, I think, one tension that exists, or one kind of subspeciation within our discipline, which is history for its own sake, on the one hand, and then those of us who are part of a department, part of a philosophy, which is, in the best possible sense, to be critiquing science, to be telling stories about science that are improving the practice of science in the present, and the place of science within society in the present. And there are many really important conversations like that going on. So we heard earlier on about the problem of the great genius figure, and so for many historians that has immediate relevance, because that creates a barrier of exclusivity of certain person types in terms of entrance into science. It creates an unrealistic idea about who speaks with scientific authority, that it's a single person rather than a consensus. That puts the public in a very difficult position when it comes to making sense of scientific claims. And so for all those reasons, I think there's a real trend or subspecies within the history of science that is about being part of those present-centered conversations, which makes us a little bit different from many other historians who are perhaps a little bit more inclined to treat the past for its own sake. So I think that's a really interesting debate. And I would say that the BSHS has nailed its colours quite firmly to the mast in that respect. For example, we're working with the British Science Association in terms of some of the inclusivity and diversity work that they're doing. The result, I think, of our institutional invisibility on a university level is a relative invisibility in traditional media, conventional media. And my hypothesis for this, which is based on zero research, is that media types kind of have in their heads the categories that they encountered as undergraduates, and those are the categories of expertise that they recognize. So it's a routine frustration to hear a historical question being asked about science, and then some professor of chemistry being trotted out to give their perspective, and we all kind of pull out our hair in frustration. How far's the taxi cab got, by the way? I think we're getting towards our destination now. How do we respond to that as a profession? Well, part of the answer we've already heard in the past hour, and that is moving into encountering audiences in new media and in these diverse niches, and there is the most tremendous and exciting work happening there. But I want to put a marker down and say universities do still matter, and I'll say why perhaps at the very end. We do need to make new expertise by enrolling new students to full and formal study of the subject. So how do we do that? I think one really obvious way is through a thing called the extended project qualification. which is something that keen sixth formers do. And those projects are very often history of science by another name. You know, robotics, what is the background of robotics? So there's something going on there. There is a level of interest that we could kind of take and frame and enable to flourish at an undergraduate level. I think science communication is so interesting as a crossover. I mean, what Fran was saying earlier was very much in that space. I often think that history of science is like good science communication that happens to be about the past. And the reason I say good science communication is because it tells you all about the science and attends to the conditions of its production. And that's exactly what good science communication should also be doing. So I think there's a promising overlap there with a brand, if you like, that is gaining increasing visibility and traction within universities. And that brings us, I guess, onto the more general point that whether or not we like it, well, none of us like it, there is a funding and institutional withdrawal from the humanities that is going on. We're waiting for the full ramifications of the Agar report, which is talking about the funding of different kinds of undergraduate study. History of science is in a funny place in that we can sort of ride on the coattails of STEM, and that comes with some pros and some potential cons. And that's, I think, a horse that we should ride because it's there, but we have to be, I guess, careful a little bit about how we do it as well. The best idea I've ever heard articulated about teaching history of science at an undergraduate level is actually Jon's idea. And he sometimes talks about pitching it as PPE for the 21st century. And I think that's absolute genius because it's about understanding the features of our world that are amongst the most important for how we decide to organise ourselves as a society and how we choose to move forward. So I think that's absolutely brilliant, and I applaud him for that idea, if we can figure out how to make sense of it. So all of this matters, I think, because what we need is a mixed and sustainable ecology of interests and enthusiasms in the history of science, something that continues to reach out to these wide audiences, these organic scholars, as Gramsci put it, the people who researching in their own capacity, but we need in the mix a really solid institutional still history of science. So let's make it happen. Thank you.
Before I invite the next speaker, I should have added, and I was inspired by something that Charlotte said, which is the very interesting question of what we mean by the past, because at this Indian event I was at, they had a panel, and then when they told me the title, they were very, very pleased with the title. And they said to me, the title is called Museums, a Prologue to the Future. And they couldn't understand why. I was kind of horrified by them. I mean, if you think about that for 2 seconds, it's a very charming, elegant, but hugely problematic view of what museums and indeed history is. Think about that. So we're now going to turn to Thomas Dixon from Queen Mary. Over to you.
Just grab a PowerPoint thing. There we go. And check what time it is. Okay. So if you think it's bad trying to explain to a taxi driver that what you study is the history of science, when you know the answer you've got to try and get across is the history of emotions, there's a whole other level, I think, of sort of embarrassment and confusion for everybody. But I'm going to try and explain to you what the history of emotions is and how it relates to the history of science. I came into the history of emotions as a sort of alumnus of the history of science at Queen Mary, University of London, where several colleagues and I set up this centre for the history of emotions about 15 years ago. And through that centre, we have strengthened our department's coverage of the history of science and medicine, but we've done that through the history of emotions as a kind of overarching centre. So in about 30 seconds, what is the history of emotions? I mean, it is what it sounds like. It's a history that pays attention to how people felt in the past, what emotions and passions and sentiments they had. There is a sort of academic interest in this question amongst historians going back to the 19th and the 20th centuries, but really, sort of as a field, it's come into existence quite rapidly in the last 20 to 30 years. It's drawn on lots of existing kinds of history, histories of the body, histories of senses, gender, culture, and importantly for us today, the histories of science, technology, and medicine. And one question I've asked myself is, like, what big changes in the histories of science, technology, and medicine have had the most impact on emotions, on the most impact on how it felt to be a person, how it felt to have emotions and feelings in the past. And on the final bullet point of this slide, I've put some of those. For example, the speed of communication. I was talking over lunch about Thomas Huxley and remembering that his sort of engagement to his fiancée happened during a period when he was traveling around the world with the Royal Navy, I think. And so it would be months and months of waiting for a letter. And that is a different emotional experience than being able to text your beloved and wait anxiously to see how many seconds it takes them to reply to you. Just take one other obvious and fairly major example that relates to romantic love. Effective contraception changes dramatically the experience of romantic love and sex when they come together. So there's a couple of examples of technologies that have changed the way that we feel. To find out loads more about the history of emotions, I've just finished writing this book. I'm afraid you can't yet buy this book, but you'll be able to pre-order it at some point in the relatively near future. And this is my sort of digest of the last 10 years of trying to work out what is the history of emotions, and you'll be able to find out next year. Now, in my final 3 minutes, I want to just talk to you about something I've done, which is in the area of impact in sort of wider society. The Centre of the History of Emotions at Queen Mary has been successful in a couple of ways. In one way, getting grants, mainly from the Wellcome Trust. Thank you very much, Wellcome Trust, which is one of the main things that we have to do in a modern university. And the other thing it's been quite successful at is having, doing those things variously known as dissemination, engagement, and impact. And what I'm about to talk about now is the work that I've done with an academy chain called TCAT, working with primary schools to try and see what we can do to get the history of emotions, get our research into primary school classrooms. And this has been a passion for me, and I've enjoyed it, and it's been quite successful. Right, so we have a series of lessons that we've made, and you can read much more online, you can listen to a podcast and so on. The result of which was these activity books, of which hundreds have been printed and are used in schools around the southeast, and a whole series of lessons. And the basic idea, okay, and I'll go back, I won't get onto that just yet. The basic idea is children do learn about emotions and emotional health and mental health in schools, both primary and secondary. The way they tend to learn about it is in a quite medicalized and quite sort of ghettoized way. We're having our lesson about mental health now, you know. We're having our PSHE lesson now, and we're going to talk to you about contraception. Or we're going to explain to you what depression is and what anxiety is and which celebrities have it, okay? And there's merit in those things. I don't want to sound too facetious, but that's the sort of caricature of the way it tends to be taught. The challenge that I set myself was, how can we use history of emotions, history of science, to give to children and young people a vocabulary and an understanding of their emotions which goes a bit beyond that very unfair caricature that I just used. So, I'm going to give you just a very quick couple of examples. One theme that we cover is friendship. And so, instead of just saying, you know, this is what a friend is and this is what bullying is, how can we get a bit of culture, a bit of science, a bit of history of science into that? I should say that these lessons, which are quite ambitious, are aimed at year 5. So that's 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds. So, for example, we give them very, very short extracts of poetry and philosophy of friendship. And then I also teach them about the friendly brain. We have a very short video about what is the brain and how has it evolved to help us be good at friendship. And this is just to give you a flavour of the slides that will pass at a much slower speed in front of the eyes of Year 5 children. But let me skip ahead to get onto the very brief history of science bit. I've just got 2 examples here of history of science that goes into these lessons. One is in a week of a theme of melancholy and the blues. A brilliant thing that we do is teach them how to write a blues song and get them to write a blues song. But in the same week, we teach them about the 4 humours. Here we go, finally, some history of science. And, well, I don't need to explain to this audience what the 4 humours were, but we have some animations that we show about that, and then they have an activity book, and they fill out some sort of fun questions, and they decide which one they are. Yeah, so are you melancholic or sanguine, and so on. So just to get them into the thought world of Renaissance medicine for a week. And then in a week on, this is on the week on joy, I think, that Charles Darwin, not looking very joyful there, makes an appearance, and it's a tiny bit of the history of evolution and the fact that Darwin wrote a book about emotions. I mean, that's about as much as I'm going to try and get across to a Year 5 class. Here is Darwin. Some of them will not have heard of him. Many of them will. Some of them will understand evolution, some will not. But then I can get across the further fact he wrote about emotions. And then that gets us into human emotions and animal emotions, which is Darwin's big interest in the topic. And what do we think about whether these animals are feeling happy, for example, just because they look like they are. And this is just a ridiculously simplified sort of bar chart showing the lessons work. At the end of 8 weeks, they know much more about emotions, and they've got a much bigger vocabulary. I mean, the way that we sort of sell it to schools, and that drives it a lot for me, actually, is about emotional literacy specifically, about expanding their vocabulary. And these lessons are all about giving them a richer verbal and visual vocabulary, and one that is informed by history, literature, the history of art, and the history of science in a way that hopefully is enriching and useful. You can find out much, much more about this online. We've got a website called the Emotions Lab. This page, we've got a couple of online games, one of them called What Are They Feeling? And both of those are games that we use with schools. The What Are They Feeling game, there's a lot of historical images of animals and humans emoting in various ways, and you have to guess what the image is supposed to show. I mean, the moral of the game is there isn't a correct answer, but what this shows is how emotions have looked different in different cultures and different historical periods over time. And those are a few references to find out more. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you. Before we move to our next speaker, I'm using the chair's arbitrary power to award you the Donald Trump Book Promotion Award. I say that with respect and affection, by the way, just so we're clear, so you're clear what emotions I'm expressing when I give you that medal. Now we're moving over to Ruselle Meade.
Hello everyone, I'm Ruselle Meade. I'm based in a school of modern languages, which I think might be a bit unusual for historians of science, but as Charlotte was pointing out earlier, historians of science can be found in various university departments and schools and so on. So the school where I'm based, we teach undergraduate and postgraduate programs in translation studies. And one of the modules that I lead is on scientific and technical translation. And at the beginning of the module, I typically ask students what makes scientific translation different from other types of translation. And invariably, they will say, sorry, I should probably, oh, that's my button, sorry. They will invariably say that scientific texts are different because they are about facts, and that they are informative text types, and therefore the emphasis needs to be on accuracy. And when I ask what specific translation challenges they might encounter, they almost always come to the question of terminology. So the challenge is finding the most accurate term to convey a specific concept. So I presume you're horrified by hearing this as historians of science, but I think, of course, it reflects a pretty wide-held view about what science communication is. But I think it's a view that historians of science are perhaps well placed to push back against. And so I draw on my own research from the history of science to encourage these students in translation studies to maybe reflect a bit more on their assumptions about scientific texts. And so I should explain, I'm a historian of modern Japan, and my research focuses on the history of science communication with a soft spot for translation in the 19th and the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So I'll just show you an example that I find quite useful. I'm assuming no one speaks Japanese, so I'll explain this. But I find this example quite useful for encouraging students to think about this idea that scientific texts are entirely about facts. So this is a book published in 1873. It's called Year-Round Epistolary Guide, Science and the Exchange of Gifts. So it's a copybook. You might be asking what science has to do with the exchange of gifts. This was published at about the time the new modernizing Meiji government implemented the Gregorian calendar in Japan. And so this calendrical revolution basically threw a range of societal practices into disarray, not least the exchange of gifts, which is, of course, very important. What you'll notice about this excerpt is that you have two separate panels, and they convey essentially the same content. There's some minor differences, but they're not huge. The important thing is that lexically they are very similar. The same words are used to explain the same content. But I think it's pretty obvious, even if you don't speak Japanese, that they're written in two markedly different styles. At the bottom, it has a very calligraphic type of quality, which suggests that aesthetic engagement is kind of the point of this text. And as I say here, it's an epistolary guide. So the idea is that it's to help readers to write their own letters. And so readers were expected to emulate not only the content of these works, but also the beauty of the script. So you have a different type of engagement happening here. Also on the bottom panel, you show the division of labor. You have an author who's written the top, a calligrapher who has written the bottom, but there's usually a third person involved, and this would normally be a well-known scholar, and that person verifies or certifies the work by penning a foreword or a preface to the work. And again, this is written in a very calligraphic style and the beauty of this script is one way of asserting or conveying the value and the trustworthiness of the work. So that's just one example of how I use material from my research to kind of challenge this idea that scientific texts are all about facts or it's all about accuracy. There's also the issue of translation and whether it's informative or not. And I try to get students to also think about the various ways in which scientific translation operates. So in the history of science, scholars have been interested in how translation has been used in the circulation of scientific knowledge and practices. But there are other ways in which translation is used, of course. It could be used as a tool in the formation of professional communities. It's also used as a tool to advance specific ideological agendas. Going back to the case of 19th century Japan, there was a period, of course, when the category of scientist was very much an unstable category and where there was a lot of difficulty attracting people to be involved in science. And at that time, would-be scientists were very active in using translation to write for example, farmers or for industrialists to argue, to assert the importance of their discipline. They would also write for adolescents, for children, or I say write, but translate. These are often translations for these groups to attract these much-needed recruits to their disciplines. In the early 20th century, anarchists were some of the biggest translators of science in Japan. They would translate works by Kropotkin, for example, to push against this Darwinian idea of evolution to advance more sort of non-hierarchical views of science. So yes, I'm going to try and go back to the theme of this panel, which was what perspectives can historians of science uniquely bring to academic and public discussions? And I would argue that it's perhaps this awareness of the importance of translation and of language in the public understanding of science. We are now emerging from a pandemic, and it was characterized by this overwhelming deluge of information. Some termed it an infodemic. And much of this information was misinformation or disinformation. It was deliberately misleading. Some people shared things that unwittingly, and this often happened over digital channels, through digital media, and across linguistic boundaries. And so translation was actually very important in the phenomenon that we've just been witnessing. And actually, a lot of that translation was not done by humans, so that's something we also need to think about. For translators, I think an important skill is identifying an ethical position in this really treacherous sort of landscape. And so I think this is perhaps where this history of science might also be useful. It's not just enough, I think, to have scientific literacy. There also needs to be this historical literacy, literacy in the history of science as well. And understanding this role of translation and of language in the communication of science in the past may give a clearer understanding of what is happening in the present. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got a million questions. Jim, over to you.
Well, I realized when I accepted this that I've had 5 minutes to speak. I've now realized that's a very long time. And to be honest, I think that's really what I want to talk about. If you have 5 minutes, not 5 minutes, say you have 2 minutes, the way you say the things, and more than that, the topic you choose to focus on is absolutely essential. It's really important to figure out what the framing is. So this is really a talk about how we frame the questions of history of science. The first issue I really want to raise is one about the focusing on the words here about old and now. And I think we've talked a lot about relevance in this meeting. I mean, one of the things I would disagree with Charlotte, I'm not sure that history has a purpose of its own. I think people have purposes for history. And so we need to think about what that purpose is whenever we're academics. Now, that one way of thinking about that is of course, relevance. And I think making sure that what we talk about is relevant to us and potentially to our audiences, it's making that dialogue between those questions really important. One issue which I think often comes up with that is that relevance is often identified with the contemporary. And we can see that, I think, in the way that Tim described the collections at the Science Museum. If so much of the material came in relatively recent years, it's quite clear that the numbers of objects and the numbers of things in the museum must be quite focused on the modern period. And this is true also in academic life. During my career, it's been very much the case that I think more and more jobs are dealing with 19th, 20th, and in fact, late 20th century science. The idea is the more relevant it is, the more applied it is in the way that John Heilbronn said. And here I really would like to agree with what Ian said about the tyranny of now. We need to think about what history is really for, and if we think about that, the now, the recent, is only part of the story, because as indeed we've realized very much in the last 20, 30 years, many things which we thought were passé, say, evangelical religion was on the way out, or ideas of global empires for major powers were on the way out. A whole range of different things. Major pandemics might be on the way out. Well, we were wrong about almost all of those things. And so it looks to me like getting back into the past becomes a particularly important question, and framing things in the right way. Now, one thing to also realize about relevance is that, of course, we have to figure out where people are coming from. And here I want to return to a theme which several people have brought out, and that is that I think most people do have the sense that science is about great discoveries. And when we add, say, women to the canon, we add Ada Lovelace, say, the idea behind that is often, well, women made great discoveries too. They could be geniuses. But the end of that is often quite similar to what you have in this cartoon here, where you have 3 guys sitting under trees, nothing yet. One of them says, how about you, Newton? And this rather large apple is ready to fall on Newton. Well, we don't all feel like we have that apple coming on top of us. And I think it's very characteristic of the way that we might think about what discovery means. I was fascinated to find this graph of discoveries of science, which again shows why this tendency to look at things in the present is often so important. If you just focused on individual discoveries, and I know there's exhibitions of like 1,000 great discoveries and so forth, you are going to get a particular sort of image of the way that science works. And if you choose certain type, like a blog or a Wikipedia article that's on a particular subject, quite often it's just going to reinforce the idea that it's individual people making individual discoveries or doing very isolated things. I've been very struck by the fact that very often the specific information in history of science in articles in Wikipedia about individual authors or subjects is often quite good, but when you get to general themes like the article on the scientific revolution, it reads like it could have been written by my old friend Rupert Hall about 40, 50 years ago in terms of what the historiographic argument is within it. And I think there's a real issue here. Take this graph of discoveries, and it doesn't include something like this. And this is, of course, an Islamic astrolabe. It's in the Science Museum here. It was bought relatively recently, so it is one of those recent acquisitions. But of course, it's a whole set of questions that aren't present in that list of discoveries, of issues about the way in which science has been involved in navigation and timekeeping and aesthetic culture, a whole range of important questions that, of course, can be brought out by an instrument like that. The problem, as Steve Shapin says in a very good article in the Los Angeles Review of Books, is not knowing science. There's just no way we're ever going to know all these individual facts about the way things were. And in fact, it may not even be knowing history in some sense, but it's knowing where science lives. It's knowing where to go to find about science and knowing how it's set in context so we can understand whether we can trust what we're hearing and what the context of the way that it's developed is. And I would argue also, and I've chosen a picture of the Science Museum's galleries here, museums are particularly good places for this because it's precisely, we can take something like that and you've got somebody who's not going to be visiting a museum for just 2 minutes. They might look at the astrolabe for 2 minutes, but they also might look at other objects in relationship to it. And if they're presented in a convincing array, and if your body moves through the exhibition during a half hour, an hour or so visit, you can really help people to start getting a much better sense of what science is and how it fits in a deeper historical past. The same is also true, I would argue, of long narratives in history of science. It's very important to recognize a lot of history books are best-selling, and some history of science books are best-selling. And I think it's really worth trying to think about how we can embed the particular findings that we're making into stories that people want to read in the same sort of way that they'd want to read, say, a novel. So what kind of lessons can we get from history of science? For many of you, of course, this is very familiar, but I think we need to think about what the understandings that we want to communicate are. One thing I remember I told a group of TV producers once that you could always tell when a documentary maker had failed when a choir started to sing in science. My favorite song in history of science is oh, that note that goes on when someone's making a great discovery. I think it would be much more effective to have a way of showing science that made it so people understood that it actually was successful for the same reasons that, say, cooking a souffle or raising a successful crop of corn are successful, or healing a person are successful. These are all activities we're much more familiar with, and at some level, it's part of that common sense of science that Thomas Henry Huxley talked about. The other thing I think that really helps about having a longue durée history of science, and here I'm not just talking about going back 50 years or 100 years or even 500 years. I'm talking about going back into the ancient Middle East and to civilizations like the Aztecs, the Mayans, and so forth, trying to figure out how people have asked questions over a very long time. It means that these aren't things that can be easily overturned. They're not just some genius idea that somebody cooked up in their bedroom, as Donald Trump might say. They're actually something that make it so that it's many people working together. And I think that's a really important and helpful way that the social history of science can reinforce science education. And then finally, and this is, I think, a particularly important point, science, people can learn, is not the product of one culture, but the result of constant interaction, conquest, and exchange. Now, this is, I think, a real issue for a place like the Science Museum, which, of course, was partly founded to celebrate British achievement and European achievement in the science. And it's also a problem for our discipline. I found this picture in a junior high school textbook from the 1930s, which I think better than anything I know illustrates the way in which the diffusionist view of science actually really operates. This is something that's very standard. Now the person, in fact, who wrote this textbook is another diagram that shows how other civilizations contributed discoveries to what went on in Europe. But ultimately, it all has to go through that obligatory passage point of Europe. Now, they put it somewhere in Paris, unfortunately, not up in France. I'm not going to say anything about why that is. It clearly should be coming direct here from here in South Kensington. The alternative views, I think, are really becoming very important within history of science. And I think this is something that both the museum, but also us as historians of science, really need to try and think about. How are we going to build the new narratives of history of science in a way that's going to take these wider questions and wider issues on board? All of some of these are quite specific books, some of them are much more general. In various ways, they represent compromises, I think, and it's always interesting to see where people do compromise. Some of them, for example, have the idea of discovery is still quite important. It's a way that various civilizations might contribute to the way that science actually operates. Some of them are quite limited in focus, so it's harder for a general audience, for example, to appreciate what lessons they might be dealing with. So a whole range of questions, but this is probably, from my point of view, I mean, like, I haven't been around quite as long as Ludi has. I would say that the shift toward practice in the 1970s and 80s was probably the biggest single change that I was involved in, and for most of us was very important. It meant that rather than one instrument, the thinking cap being the crucial instrument for understanding science, a whole range of things within a museum like this suddenly became relevant to the history of science. And that's a huge change, and it's changed the way in which the discipline and museums can interact. But I think that change is now being challenged in terms of its significance by the move towards a much more, what people call it global sometimes, but I think of it as an interactionist point of view, which means that Europe is no longer just the center of things. To really have that perspective doesn't mean just looking, say, at the 20th century or the late 19th century. To be honest, by that point, you're looking at a situation where a lot of the European powers are so strong that a lot of the action is really over. It's the longer term story that really matters. I think it's looking back, in some cases, thousands of years and trying to figure out how humans generally have actually tried to adapt to the natural world, and how ideas like the expert, which was really a creation of many thousands of years ago, how that happened, where did that kind of thing come from? So if history of science is going to be global, it also needs to have a temporal extent which goes into the deep past. Thanks.
Jon, over to you. He's got a bag. I'm already nervous. What's going to happen?
So I'm putting these on to signify that I am, in fact, from the future. What I will say is therefore not dubious what-if history. No, what I'm going to report are facts about the past known with the certainty of hindsight. Looking back, science in the 21st century continued to develop in responses to challenges. And this should be no surprise to you. Your historians had already shown that in the 20th century, much science had responded to such problems. Such problems as the maintenance of human and other bodies in health, problems such as the building and maintenance of the military, building technological systems that work, and understanding changes in the Earth's atmosphere and its populations. So in 2028, science was busy contributing to the remarkably rapid decarbonisation of post-Putin Russia, while also swiftly dispatching the Omega variant of the coronavirus. Yet this was not the best of all possible worlds. The flaw, for a while, was that the voice of the many had still not been properly heard. Who got a say in what problems, what challenges were most pressing? Now it's humbling to be here in the 2020s at the Science Museum where the breakthrough was made. It started by a mistake. A helper at the Science Museum, with a map in hand, asked a visitor from Hull an innocent question: where would you like to go next? The visitor interpreted the question as one about what world would she want to live in. What challenges mattered to her, what did she value, and how might science and technology help reach that destination? With astonishing speed, the science museums around the world pivoted to becoming the democratic interface between publics and science. History of Science mapped out past possibilities, past forks in the road, recognised patterns of exclusion and inclusion, justice and injustice. If we want a better future, we must honestly appraise the past. Contemporary science offered new paths, but always there was a recognition of choice, always allowing all voices to contribute. Quickly becoming a model, displaying possible futures grounded on history of science, putting institutional power behind the articulation of voices, science museums enabled people to find a best way through technological worlds. And then the machine struck back. Anxiety about machine learning and artificial intelligence had been building in the 2020s. By 2030, complete digitization of archive sources, plus sophisticated machine learning, a bit beyond what you're familiar in 2022, created panic amongst historians of science. They might soon become technology redundant. Not only were machines better at historical reasoning, but their steps of reasoning were triply obscured, complex, in private hands, and inscrutable. Yet again, it was the democratic interface of the science parliaments taking place in this very room that saved the day. It was precisely one of those forks in the road that needed deliberation and consensus. And the answer was encouragement to use machines within regulations that ensured fairness, public benefit, and the right to know reasoning. Thus enhanced, hand in hand with machines, historians of science stepped confidently into the future. I'm now going to come back to the present.
Thanks for that great thought experiment. Panel, I've got so many questions for you, but I'm going to restrain myself if I can, because I'm sure that the audience will have questions, because you've stimulated so many interesting challenges in that. Everyone's still absorbing the idea of John. They can't quite work out whether he's 800 years old or slightly younger. Any questions with our roving mic as well? There's one right at the back.
Thank you. Hello, Keith Dunmore, PhD researcher and science communicator. My question is about the place where science lives and the recipes to make it. Currently, we're in a divided world, and my concern is about people using maps to go to a place that looks like science and picking up a frozen pizza and thinking that it's a recipe. I'm just wondering, how do we deal with that?
Run that by me. I'm not sure I fully get what your core question is, so run that by me.
I always do that.
Yeah.
If my supervisor or someone similar were in the room, they would bash me and say, you always do that. So my question is, there are places that look like science, and there are things that sound like science, and there's an awful lot of that at the moment. How do we, as historians or as science communicators, so maybe separating those two things out, how do we cope with that, talk about that, deal with that? Because if people aren't coming to us and they're going there, what do we do?
Right, I've got it now. Jim.
Okay, is this, yeah. That's obviously the crucial question. Steve Shapin answers it quite a lot better. If you look in the Los Angeles Review of Books, he has an article that's about this question. I think that the question, I think, is really making sure that when we do have a chance to teach people who aren't going to become scientists, or indeed to some extent when they are scientists, about science, that they learn not so much just lots of scientific facts or individual discoveries or even facts about history, but how to investigate the question themselves in a reasonable way. And that partly involves teaching principles of discretion about what's important, what is a legitimate degree, there are a lot of questions about it. And I think everyone who, even if you're just trying to buy something in the internet, it's a question that you have to ask yourself, is this a real review by somebody, or is it just a bot reporting it? And you learn skills of discrimination. And quite often they're quite fine-grained skills. So I think teaching people the way in which science works, the processes, I think there have been some good opportunities during the pandemic for teaching some of these skills. Obviously, some of the opportunities have been lost, but I think people have realized to some degree that sometimes saying, I'm following the science, isn't a very good way of talking about what they're doing. And there's been much more talk about that as an issue than I think there would have been without the pandemic. People are aware that science is fallible and it has to move on. So I think these kinds of questions, we need to use those opportunities like that. But I think history has lots of possibilities for helping with that, precisely because it shows things that look like they're certain, how they were made and unmade. And yet, on the other hand, how so much of what we know is actually securely embedded in forms that are used every day in a way that's very familiar. So I think the kind of the induction from the history of science that philosophers are always wanting to draw, which is that all science is ultimately going to be proved false, is partly useful for us, but it's also a question of, well, it's an awful lot of what science has done, maybe most of what science has done, has been proved true as well. So I think there's a kind of very interesting balance there.
Can I dwell on that and pull the panel in just to broaden that question, because when I look at the question, the thing, and my colleagues will laugh at me when I raise this, because it's the one thing guaranteed to send me into the stratosphere with irritation, is that people always say to me, well, of course, Ian, surely the core purpose of the Science Museum is to tell the public about the scientific method. At which point I go, no! Except I know what they mean, and they're coming from a good place. And I was inspired to think about that by what you said, Ruselle, because you said two very contradictory things in a good way. You talked beautifully with great nuance about in Japan in that period, scientists being an unstable category, but you also mentioned at the end the extreme of our colleagues, our families, the whole world we live in, suddenly almost venerating science too much because of the vaccine hunt. And I wondered, similarly, the questions were also raised in a way by Jon at the end, which is the question that actually, who's part of that scientific method? So I just wonder that a lot of people I deal with, you don't have to deal with so much, politicians think it's very simple, that the answer to the question, and we've heard a panel with immense subtlety and nuance. What do you think about the easy reductive answer, we should venerate and worship at the temple of the scientific method? Charlotte, the look of disdain on your face, I think we should go with you first.
Yeah, the horror of that phrase, the scientific method. It's infallible and there's only one of them. I think that's an incredibly pervasive understanding of what science is. And so I think, going back to Keith's question, I think part of the challenge of history of science is showing the communication work that lay behind the institution of a particular fact or a particular technology. And so in the modern era, we might want to talk about how peer review works, for example, what happens when scientists disagree. But then there's a deeper history to that as well, which is a history of trust and how consensus is built. So it's an uncomfortable truth, I think, for people who are really into that idea of the scientific method. It was one of Jim's point that science is the best knowledge that we have, and it's made by consensus, but it's not somehow a conduit of truth from heaven.
Let's look at some more audience questions, and I'll bring the panel on some of the others. Lady just here, in the third row. Just here first. Sorry, forgive me. Yeah.
Sorry, I should have waved my hand more effectively. I'm Amanda Rees, and I'm the editor of the Society's journal, and I'm just very pleased to be able to say that one key institutional niche for historians of science is clearly after-dinner speaker, after listening to those wonderful talks. But my question has to do with the future, not in quite the way that Jon had it. Wonderful as that depiction of a hopefully alternate vision of the future is. And it's to do with the next generation. One of the questions that I always have when I have students come to me and wanting to do a PhD, when I have PhD students who are looking for their next job, we know that we're in a situation of immense precarity. We know that the jobs that are out there are few and far between, and the jobs that exist are likely to be temporary jobs in which it's very, very difficult for people to be able to develop the kind of research interest that even I've had the privilege of being able to do. And I know despair is a sin, so I try not to think too hard about that sometimes. And I don't want to direct this at Tom and to ask him how one deals with despair in that sense. But I did wonder how you folk on the panel, how do you manage those thoughts? Is this something that you worry about when the next generation comes to you and asks for, because they're as passionate as we are about the history of science. And I love teaching, and I love supervising. But a little bit of me always breaks when somebody comes and says, I want to do a PhD. Because I think, what are you going to do after it, and how can I help you? And is this the right place for you?
We've been speaking a lot about the need for science literacy for, as I mentioned in my my short talk, history of science literacy, and I was really heartened by the presentations in the first panel, particularly by Alice and Hope on the digital possibilities. So yes, there is. I personally feel that there's definitely scope beyond a sort of very rigid trajectory where we need people with these skills and where it could be very beneficial.
Jim, do you want to?
Yeah, I think this partly just bears out what the others have said, but I think that the history of science has always been a rather indisciplined discipline in the sense that it hasn't really been located just in one place. It's been located in lots of different sorts of departments and lots of different and also in museums, libraries. And one thing also I think is these days, it's if you want to write, it used to be that what you would do is you would work in journalism, you'd get paid in a regular job, and you'd write a book on the side. If it was successful, then you'd go on and you could become an author. That route has become much more difficult for nonfiction authors, but I think one way of, if you are interested in writing, is to choose a PhD topic, and I've seen several of my students certainly have done that, and are now either authors or do technical report writing or other sorts of things where they use those skills, but they've also been able to publish their PhD and work that through. So I think there's lots of ways in which the skills that you learn within this field are highly transferable and actually quite useful for many different subjects. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind.
Also, I would beg you not to give up, because do remember that millions and millions and millions of people come to this museum and all our museums, and we know that they love what you do. I mean, it would be a great irony at this, in a way, at all. Also, my great joke with Charlotte is, having spent years at the V&A, where I was surrounded by art historians, untroubled by self-doubt in any way. In my long experience of art historians, this is not the moment to let them win. Not that I'm being competitive. Now, we're over, but if there are any more questions, I think, yes, just, there's the one I can't quite see because of the blinding stage lights, but there's one down at the front here, right at the front, in the second row here.
Sorry.
I think this might be our last question, actually.
I'm Graham Stott. I'm just recently joined as a volunteer ambassador at the Science Museum. So my question was, in terms of niches, do we need more science or historians of science in the House of Commons or in our political parties?
Tom, you look very keen to answer that one.
When we were just talking about PhDs and what you might do with them, I was just thinking how great it would be if every member of Parliament had to do a PhD in the history of science before they were allowed into.
But we also, I notice, I mean, the science lobby has been calling for more science-trained politicians since the late 19th century, right? And it's always seen as a panacea. If only we had more trained scientists. I've written a book on Margaret Thatcher. I can tell you that having a trained scientist is as a most senior politician, has advantages, yes, but there are disadvantages too, and it's no panacea.
But just taking some inspiration from your question, it goes all the way back to where I started, which is the point I was trying to make is that I really do see quite a lot about power, okay, in the world. And I can't stress to you enough how kind of slightly depressing it is when you're at these kind of big policy events full of super bright young people who have enormous influence on the energy transition, on health choices, all the power issues that Jon was talking about. And they've all studied, economics and PPEs. There are a lot of people who are invisible to you, but having a big influence on your life, and they have almost no empathy or deep understanding of science at all. And they don't have to be scientists, they just have to respect for, the principles of discretion, which is Jim's rather important point. So I agree with you, although as I meet an enormous number of MPs all the time, it's going to be a very interesting challenge to move towards your ambition. I think, unfortunately, time is running on, and I think we have come to the end of questions. I will, I think, be haunted probably at 3 a.m. by Jon in his little. We love you dearly, but I have to say, wow, that was quite something. But thank you all so much. It really, more than anything, the biggest thank you is, in fact, to all of you for being here. And I meant what I said. I mean, you do noble work, and we're here. As I said to Charlotte, I think now is the time for the Science Museum to do even more, to actually be a champion of something of such profound importance. So thank you to you, thank you to the panel, and I think it's time for a drink.